I'm Ernst Zündel, President of Samizdat Publishers in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'm going to give you one man's opinion, my opinion, about Steven Spielberg and Steven Spielberg's recent blockbuster film, promoted like very few other films before it, and apparently now decorated and given prizes and lauded by all and sundry about how great and how wonderful it is. The film is called Schindler's List, as if you didn't already know it. Everybody in the media, bar none, has talked about this particular Hollywood flick. Now, I first got alerted to this film by having received a newspaper in translation from Brazil called Ilustrada, a large Brazilian newspaper out of Sao Paulo, of October the 14th, 1993, which was just at the beginning when the promoters began to launch and lodge human interest stories about the making of the film and how it would soon come out and so on. And my ears perked up and my eyes opened wide when I saw an interview by a Brazilian Jewish reporter called Marco Chiaretti, who met Mrs. Emilie Schindler, the wife of Oskar Schindler, who appears briefly in the film at the end in person, as a real person, when she visits the grave of Oskar Schindler together with other Jews in a cemetery in Israel. She's in a wheelchair in that particular part of the film, and in the article out of the Brazilian newspaper Ilustrada, there's nothing mentioned that she is crippled, which surprised me. But she gave this rather frank interview about the film and about Oskar Schindler, whom throughout this whole page interview she never refers to as my husband Oskar or my sweetheart. She only refers to him as Schindler, which already kind of shocked me, because I realized that the appellation Schindler, meaning by his last name, must mean that she didn't have all that good an impression of Oskar. And sure enough, the article is replete with stories of crookedness, black marketeering, and corruption, and inconsistencies. She refers to her husband as being a stupido, and yet Steven Spielberg makes him into a very cunning, clever wheeler dealer. So somewhere between the film and the reality, as is usual for Hollywood, there is this vast gap, and I proceeded to begin to investigate. Here is what the Schindler widow says, and I think that she's about as close to the truth as we can come, since Oskar Schindler himself is dead. She says that they lived in a German-speaking area of Czechoslovakia, which must be the Sudetenland. She never mentions the town that they lived in, but she says it is near Pilsen. Of course, that was a German-speaking area. And then she says something very peculiar. We were both German-speaking. Now, I refer to myself as being an English-speaking person, but I am a German. And so if no German says I'm German-speaking, because it's the most obvious thing that a German is German-speaking, so already it would indicate that the Schindlers thought of themselves as something other than German. And then a peculiar thing happens in real life, not in the film, in real life. Schindlers flee, or leave, in quote, the Sudetenland as soon as Adolf Hitler comes into the Sudetenland. Now you must understand that the Sudeten Germans had been clamoring for 20 years to join the Greater German Reich, and in a plebiscite voted 99.5 or 99.8 to join Hitler Germany. And here the Schindlers apparently fled and left for Krakow in Poland. Now Krakow in Poland at that time was anti-German. The whole Polish border area was teeming with anti-German hatred. There were pogrom-like events taking place, and Germans were fleeing from Poland to Germany when they could. Certainly the Polish authorities were not welcoming German refugees. So that would indicate that Schindler certainly was no Nazi, otherwise he would have stayed behind, if he was a German at all. Interestingly, in the film, Schindler from the very beginning wears a golden party pin, which was issued to only 100,000, if memory serves me correctly, of the oldest members of the Nazi Party, I think pre-1927. Now, how this young man, who was 20 years old according to his gravestone, when all these events took place, how he got a golden party pin, that meant he was one of the absolute first Nazis, and then he fled from Germany, Hitler's Sudetenland, Germany, into Poland to set up a pots and pans factory. Now you can see how reality and the film clash. No wonder Mrs. Schindler says that the Keneally book was wrong and contains a great deal of invented material, in answer to the question if it was a documentary or not. And she said it was not Schindler who helped these Jews, it was her. So Spielberg should have made a film about her, according to her, not about her husband. But it's interesting how she never mentions that they set up this pots and pans factory with Jewish money. The impression in the interview is that it was their money, Oskar Schindler's money. In the film, it is callously stated that he basically squeezed some black marketeer Jews in a very hard-driven bargain for mountains of cash to set up the factory, and had these Jewish slave laborers work their derrieres off, and had his Jewish accountant keep his books, because he, the German, was work shy. Now, as a German, that seems to me like a total reversal of the roles traditionally understood by our two peoples. That we, the Germans, are the lazy, money-grubbing bosses, and that the Jews are the noble, hard-working people doing the manual labor. Very, very strange. But Mrs. Schindler does another thing. She says that Oskar traded diamonds for food or vodka or coffee, and then in return turned the coffee over to a crooked, corrupt veterinarian, who then would give him the carcasses of dead or deceased animals so that he could feed his Jews in his factory. Now, I was raised in Germany during the Second World War, and I remember distinctly as a boy when the animal census takers would come to our farm, and we had to fence all our animals into kind of stockyards. And this census taker, who was a uniformed official from the local town, and he would come with this pad and in triplicate or quadruplicate mark down how many chickens, how many roosters, and how many hens, how many goats, sheep, cows, horses, pigs, even cats and dogs that we had on our farm. Now, some of you might think, impossible. No, that's the way it was. I'll tell you why. Because it was very important. You had to deliver to the war effort, if you had a farm, X number of eggs. And if, for instance, your cow died, it wasn't your cow. Or if your cow got old and you had to butcher it, it wasn't your cow. You got a certain amount of your cow, and the rest of the society got the rest of the cows. Because we had a war on, and everybody had to share. And if an animal had an accident, let's say fell over a wall or got hit by a truck or whatever, even was deceased, and you had to kill it on the spot, because, or shoot it or stab it with an axe or a knife or whatever, in order to what we call Notschlachtung, an emergency butchery job, you had to make a beeline to the local city hall and had to report it, because, again, the carcass wasn't yours. Otherwise, every farmer undoubtedly would have had the excuse, and 1,000 cows a day would have run in front of 1,000 trucks or bicycles. Of course, this is human logic. And so, if a German city dweller had a cat or had a dog, since ration cards were so tight in the calculation of what you could get on them, how many grams or how many ounces of fat and so on, there wasn't enough slack in there to also feed your cat or your dog. And so there were ration coupons for dogs, for animal food. And animal lovers in America and Canada and the rest of the world will appreciate that, because a big dog consumes a lot of meat products. And we all know when we go to the supermarket that shelves are stacked full of the various cat foods and dog foods. No different for the Germans. So the idea that a veterinarian could trade for Oskar Schindler hundreds of carcasses, which he would have had to, because 1,200 or 1,300 or 1,100 Jews, they can never make up their mind how many he really had. Let's say he had 1,200 Jews. That means a lot of mouths to feed. And let's say the veterinarian was corrupt on the local scene, and he did trade him the carcass of a dead cow or of a goat. Can you imagine how small the portion would have become to feed 1,200 people? So you see, whenever you see these Hollywood films and movies, you have to be very critical in what they're telling you. Because if it's properly analyzed, Schindler very quickly becomes a Schwindler. Which is not surprising when you see the rest of the film. Mrs. Schindler had very little good to say about her husband. He exploited his Jewish laborers, apparently. He did make a huge profit out of them, because apparently he didn't have to pay these laborers except for their room and board, and the rest of it he had to pay a 5 mark or 7 mark fee per day to some German government office, and the rest was clear profit for him. So the story goes. And he didn't want to hire Poles, because Poles got paid 5 marks a day or 7 marks a day or 8 marks a day, depending on their level of skill. And so naturally, Schindler, being the ruthless exploiter of slave labor, got the Jews for nothing. That's the way the story is. Mrs. Schindler says she went out to help get food for his Jewish workers. He struck up a friendship with a German noblewoman who said, "Bring your truck to my mill and I'll get you some food." Now, what kind of trucks do you think were available in those days? Watch any Hollywood film, watch any newsreels. The trucks in those days in that part of the world were at most, if they were German army type trucks, a little bigger than a pickup truck today. And if they were Soviet trucks of the Model A variety, which were the prevalent truck type, they were really, really quite small. And if 1,200 people had to be fed from the content of this one truckload of food, believe me, they wouldn't have eaten for very long. Because even if they had only 2 or 3 slices of bread a day, divided a truckload full of flour into that amount of bread, is maybe a week or 2. So something is wrong basically with the story in here. Anyways, the war goes bad for the Germans, and Schindler stops making pots and pans and instead is beginning to make bazookas, according to her, Panzerfaust she called it, and artillery shells. And she says that they sabotaged the production of these things and made bad shells and bad bazookas. Well, again, you can tell that maybe to the non-critical and not very well historically educated North American audience, but to a German who knows about the wartime situation and production methods, of course the Germans were alert to the fact that there was going to be sabotage in camps and in factories run by foreign labor. And so each shell, like each rifle, even parts of each rifle, had a number and a code so that you could check back and trace back who manufactured this particular shell, this particular gun, or this particular bazooka. And believe me, if other Hollywood films are correct, the brutal, vicious Nazi security service and Gestapo would quickly have tracked down who manufactured an inordinate number of shells that didn't work. And what? They would have gone to the factory, lined the people up from the director on down, and undoubtedly did something to them. At least send them into one of the concentration camps, if they didn't charge them with treason and sabotage and shoot the people. Which, of course, if you did it in the United States or in the Soviet Union, would also be your fate. So there's, again, a big, big loophole in the Schindler story, that they would go on manufacturing for good, hard German cash weapons and shells which didn't fire. However, Oskar Schindler had this knack, according to his wife, to be the perpetual survivor and womanizer. At the end of the war, he flees to the West, and in due time finds himself in Argentina with enough money to immediately buy a 50-hectare farm. And the 50-hectare farm is used by him to put a fur, like a nutria ranching, a mink ranch, together. His wife warned him against this because she apparently came from an agricultural production outfit. Her father had this kind of a firm, and so she was knowledgeable in it. And she warned her husband, Oskar, not to do that. And no, Oskar goes ahead and promptly goes bust. Now, he takes off to Europe, to Germany. Why? Because now he suddenly is going to get restitution for the factory, apparently, that he lost in the East. He takes this money, blows it in Europe on wine, women, and song, and dies in 1971 or 72, and then wants to be buried in Israel. And the Israelis, who are very nationalistic, very anti-Nazi, who had just the Eichmann trial 10 years before that, and constantly berate Nazism as the greatest evil and monstrous philosophy on the face of the earth, know nothing better than to allow this scoundrel, this war profiteer, who had fed his Jewish slave laborers animal carcasses of deceased animals and so on, and they give him this special birth in a special cemetery for righteous Gentiles, even though he was, according to the film, the wearer of a golden party pin, which makes him a member of the Nazi elite. So much for the story out of Mrs. Schindler's mouth. He was a scoundrel, according to her. He wasted money. He left his wife high and dry. She had to finally sell the farm in order to live. That wasn't enough until B'nai B'rith, a Jewish service organization, put her up in a little house and pays her apparently something for her upkeep. So much for the hero. Now let's come to the film. I went to see the film and I sat for 3 hours through this film. It's, in my opinion, as a German person that has seen many an anti-German film over the last 40 years of my life, one of the most disgusting displays of anti-German animosity, if not to say hatred, that I have ever seen. And you know, in the media, a great deal is made when Nazi films are being discussed. For instance, the great German movie maker Leni Riefenstahl, that made the very famous film which I was shown as a university student in Montreal in 1964 and 65 as one of the greatest propaganda films ever made, called Triumph of the Will. The media and the university professors say and said that this was a revelation, the inner revelation of the Nazi soul. It was the bearing of the Nazi soul by this gifted German Nazi movie maker. And then there was another German who made a film called The Eternal Jew, called Fritz Hippler, in which he briefly compares the behavior of rats to the behavior of Jews. We have seen this over and over again, used as films in university school classes, even in high school classes, seen it on television. It's an often repeated scene, always this rat scene. And so, in the film that Steven Spielberg made, there is allusion to that part of that film where Jews are compared to rats. Because the film that Steven Spielberg concocted together is a typical, what we call Hollywood formula film. Most people just go and watch a film and enjoy it, are thrilled by it, moved to tears, disgusted by it. But in effect, films have long ago ceased to be just a form of storytelling. Films are very cleverly concocted by marketing analysts, and they're composed of 3% frontal nudity, 2% sadomasochism, 5% car chases, 3% gunfire. You know what I mean? In other words, every segment of the viewing audience gets a little slice for itself to satisfy its own interest in order that the film reaches a wide enough audience and makes money. So Steven Spielberg is no newcomer to the formula film. Also, Steven Spielberg is not a newcomer to making anti-German films. Those of you who have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, or even the old Star Wars series, will remember Darth Vader in his black German army-style helmet, exaggerated so that even the blind person could see it, the relation, where his soldiers are called stormtroopers, where they carry ray guns, which are spray-painted German machine guns. Now, the Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark film are nothing but viciously anti-German films. And so if Leni Riefenstahl, the Nazi movie producer, bears her German Nazi soul, how about Steven Spielberg, the Jew, bearing his Jewish soul? Am I not justified as a German person to ask that after such a record? Yes, I am. Now, children are being dragged to this latest Steven Spielberg film. The film is one where there is not a single German person that matters in the film, that is decent, not even the hero, if he is indeed a German Schindler. He is a womanizer, a corrupt man who corrupts everything that he touches, buys people off, constantly is in bed with pretty but whorish-looking young women. He is crooked, keeps double sets of books. He betrays his wife in a very callous manner, and so on. Ad infinitum, he's an exploiter of slave labor. He tolerates vicious cruelty. And in the end, the hero of the film redeems himself only. Why? Because he betrays his own people's, meaning the German people's interest, if he is indeed a German, and a Nazi he claims to be, by manufacturing shells worth millions of marks that go to the soldiers on the front who are trying desperately to save their fatherland from the invasion of Bolshevist hordes, and he sends them ammunition which doesn't fire. And he says to his Jewish accountant Stern, in one poignant moment, he said, "Stern, I would be very unhappy if one grenade left my factory that actually worked." And he does only redeem himself, A, because he becomes a traitor and saboteur of the war effort, and B, because he saves not Germans, those he sacrifices because they don't get proper ammunition, by saving Jews, by being crooked, by being corrupt. Every single person that this fellow in Steven Spielberg shows buys somebody off, manipulates somebody else. There is wife beating, not wife beating, there is violence towards women in that film, where this one German officer mercilessly beats this Jewish girl because he is sexually attracted to her but feels that he couldn't have sex with her, and instead he beats her mercilessly, right on the full screen. Women, German women and Polish women, are always shown like these sex objects in their shiny satin gowns with their nipples showing. They're showing stark naked frontal nudity. They're showing them in lineups, stark naked men and women, and they're showing them in bed as a woman mounts Schindler All this, and children from school are being taken as whole school classes into this film. He makes fun of marriage. Everything that he does, he corrupts. And so when I look at this film, it basically shows not a single decent German having a single redemptory character trait. They're all serving like robots, the most vicious, cruel system. There is more wanton shooting, more wanton beating, more dogs being set on people, more Jewish people being driven out of their homes. There is not a single Jewish person in that film that isn't noble, long-suffering, enduring, with religious Jewish ceremonies, and there isn't a single German in the film that is really worth anything. As a matter of fact, when I got away from the film, I thought, boy, it is a miracle that German people can walk the streets of the Western world without being stoned after so much hatred directed towards them. Now, I want to come to a couple of real historical inaccuracies. They show a conveyor belt taking bodies to a pile where now suddenly they're no longer burned in pits, they're burned on mountains of corpses. That's a new one. And Steven Spielberg is obviously responding to the revisionist argument. He also no longer shows gassing in the gas chambers with shower heads. The shower heads now cunningly and shockingly to the audience actually dispense water, not gas. And the gassing is kind of hinted at by people shuffling into an underground gas chamber. The one image that none of these Holocaust promoters can really let go is the burning of the bodies, the floating and wafting around of human ashes, and the crematory. The film towards the end shows this billowing black smoke coming out of the crematory, even though it has been long known that crematories do not billow black smoke or white smoke or any other smoke. So historically the film is totally inaccurate. It is morally, it is corrupt, it is corrupting, it makes fun of the Christian religion, it makes fun of every segment of German society. It is basically a vicious, anti-German film. It speaks volumes for the North American media and political and religious elites, that they are not up in arms against this corrupting film and corrupting influence and historically, politically, and morally perverse film, because it means they themselves have become so inured to bigotry and are themselves so bigoted against Germans that they no longer are able to recognize it. That to me is the saddest of all. I thought as a German person we had left this era behind us, but we obviously have not. So, as far as I'm concerned, Steven Spielberg's Schindler and Steven Spielberg are a swindler. It's rape of the mind and rape of the soul. I am Ernst Zündel in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Auf Wiedersehen.